Welcome back to another episode of Foolproof Theology. My name is Chase Davis, and I'm your host. It's good to be with you here today. We have a great conversation with Pastor Matt Patrick. We're going to talk about Big Eva, the response to a book called Shepherds for Sale, and what it can teach us about remaining humble and teachable and confident in the Lord in the midst of various trials. Before we get into that, I wanted to make sure you knew about a great product that I use called Ion Layer. You've probably heard me talk about this before, but I use Ion Layer as a great way to keep my energy up, help with muscle recovery, and keep my NAD plus levels up. Ion Layer is an at-home NAD plus infusion, and these things normally cost thousands of dollars. If you were to go get an IV drip of NAD, it's going to cost you thousands of dollars. But Ion Layer uses a special technology, a patch that's been used in the medical field for ages. For those who are allergic or have a bad reaction to IVs, you can get a patch, use the same NAD plus compounds to really help your energy production, muscle recovery after a workout, or just to keep you active. By the time you're age 50, your NAD levels are about 50% of what they used to be in your 20s. And so people go to these clinics to get NAD supplements, and now you can get them at home. So I want you to go over to ionlayer.com, use code FPT, that stands for Foolproof Theology, FPT. That'll get you $100 off your first order. That's about a 20% discount. That's a great deal. It really helps you with your recovery, energy, and health. And so I'd encourage you to head over there, get that. I know if you listen to this podcast, you know I'm a big believer in health and fitness. And so head over to ionlayer.com, use code FPT today, get $100 off your first order. Let's get into today's conversation with Matt Patrick. I'm your host. It's great to be with you here tonight. We are recording tonight. This is one of the rare times I record at night. And tonight I have my friend Matt Patrick on the show. Matt, thank you for joining me tonight.
Oh, happy to be here. I'm out in my backyard with the crickets in the background, and
it's lovely.
Yeah, lovely. Setting the ambiance.
It's very much ambiance. And tonight I'm having some whiskey, Wild Turkey 101. And I don't know what are you having, Matt?
A little Woodford. I came on this because I thought, like, Foolproof Theology, I'd get a bottle sent over before the show, but it didn't happen.
Yeah, maybe one day we'll get monetized, and I had one guy, and I had to cancel the interview before it happened. But one guy, I reached out to him, and he was like willing to come on. He was like, "So yeah, when do I fly out?" And I was like, "I can't. I don't fly people out to like record. This isn't like Joe Rogan or something. Like, I wish I could do that, but not reality for me."
Yeah, your listeners just need to start buying your advertisements.
That's right. That's right.
And then you can do that stuff.
Yeah, subscribe. Smash that subscribe button.
Patreon, Hillsdale, all of it. Get
all
it
of it. All of it. All right. So tonight, I wanted to have Matt on because Matt and I talk a lot. Obviously, we work together at the Well Church, and so we get to talk a lot about church and work on finishing our building, which we're about to move into, which is really exciting. But we also talk about like current events and what's going on in evangelicalism. And so whether you view that as a partner in crime or a co-laborer in the gospel, whatever you want to phrase us as, we get to talk a lot. But one of the things we talk about, and one topic that's kind of come up in the discourse either online or on bookshelves even, is this book called Shepherds for Sale. And I've had Megan on the show to talk about it, but I thought I'd have Matt on. Matt offers a unique perspective on pastoring people, and he's made mistakes just like all people have in ministry, and obviously a lot of successes in ministry as well. Obviously his biggest success is having me as a friend and hiring me at the Well. So
yes, my diamond in the rough, Chase Davis. For everybody who listens to Chase all the time, I do have to say this. What most people don't know is that for years, I kept telling Chase he needed to talk more and use his voice. And now I can't get him to shut up. And so he listens. He's teachable.
I am correctable.
Now we're just trying to get him back over a little bit.
Fantastic. Well, one of the topics that we've wrestled with, we have experience with, and if you're a listener, you probably know this. If you're on Twitter, if you're not on Twitter, you may not know this, but this concept of Big Eva, kind of the machine, the ministry industrial complex, regime evangelical, all of those have different like nuances. And so I'm going to ask you, when you think about kind of that kind of world, maybe how would you describe it to somebody who has never heard that concept, Big Eva, regime evangelical?
Yeah, I think it's changed for me over the years, for sure. I would say probably like you in many respects. I mean, I know you well, that for a long time, I wouldn't have viewed many of what we call Big Eva as in the negative light like I do now. those were the people that I thought I was supposed to respect. I was supposed to look up to. They were supposed to be like heroes and guides in a way. And I know, Chase, you've heard this, but I remember when I took over a church, my first church before the well, I was 22 and I had no idea what I was doing. And I remember like just sitting alone in the middle of the night in my office, just so scared. And I was like, what do I do? And I remember like emailing John Piper and Matt Chandler and Mark Driscoll and all these guys, which is funny to say that out loud now, but back then that's who was like, in the kind of the reformed world, who were the big names, and Matt Chandler was up and coming, and I was like emailing them like, I don't know what I'm doing. Can you guys help me? And they never replied, of course, which I didn't expect them to. But but a lot of those, it's kind of this system, if you will, that's been established. And what we learned over time was that it's kind of like an insular community of pastors or publishers, podcasts, YouTube channels, seminaries that kind of work in cohesion together. And I'm not one of those guys. I really like. There's a lot of people out there that would say these guys like it's like a cabal kind of thing, right?
Sure.
Like they have this nefarious plan out there. I think some of them definitely do, and we can get into that maybe later. But I think for the most part, it's kind of like just like any other group. They have like their group text and their chats and stuff. And how do we kind of keep elevating our position? And what they do is they try to keep out those that might challenge it. And that's where it's kind of turned into the negative over the last, I would say, 10, 15 years or so, is it's kind of mega churchy, if you will, or if you've written a big book and how to get published and all that kind of stuff. But there is a set of rules. It's you know me, I love baseball. Baseball is the game of unspoken rules, right? You're allowed to slide into second base with your cleats up, but if you do it, it's a big no-no and you're going to get hit next time.
Mm-hmm.
In the Big Eva world, there's a lot of unspoken rules. You don't ever talk negatively about certain people. You never challenge. You don't push. And if you do, maybe you just do it quietly in an email and you might get something back that's like, hey, thanks for that. Have a good day. And you're supposed to just move on with your life. And so it's kind of become this thing. And then I think really what happened with Big Eva and starting in, I mean, you can really kind of identify some points in time, right? Like 2016, 2020, up to 2024 is it almost got weaponized in a way that I never thought I would see it be weaponized against the church. And I think that's why Megan Basham's book actually is so important, is because it's an actual journalist writing about what happened with Big Eva. And I think their desire to grow and to have influence was probably a pretty big motivator behind all that happened there that she's calling out in her book.
Yeah, and it's something we've talked a lot about, and I've read some about throughout church history. There's different, dynamics at play with different governments and different power structures with, whether it's monarchy or a democratic republic or, whatever you want to call it, Constantine, an emperor. You'll have different power structures and even the way those governments are set up and kind of the cultural narrative. But, what what have you seen in the last, because you've been in ministry since 2007, I think.
Yeah.
And so how have you seen it change? Because I think there's an inevitable relationship between the kingdom of God, ministers, parachurch ministries, publishers, all these things and entities and people involved, that the people of God want to have an impact. They want to reach people for Christ. What did you see change maybe, or how did you change over the course of time to where you kind of see it as negative today?
Yeah, I would say, it's funny. I think back to when I started, and that was college ministry. I wasn't a pastor then. I was doing campus ministry. And it was funny. I was on a very liberal college campus where I was at the time. And that was during that was the Bush Kerry election. I remember being there for that and all of that kind of fun stuff right before that, actually, or right after that. Yeah. I'd been right around then. And, I just remember being like, it seemed fine actually to talk about things like politics.
Mm-hmm.
And I remember having conversations with Christians about who you're going to vote for and It's funny. I mean, just to let you know just how much the world's changed. The Overton window, as they refer to it, has changed. I mean, I'm in a liberal college. I remember one of my degrees was in sociology, and I had a lesbian professor who would actively defend my position to the class because she knew I was the only person in there who believed the things that I believe. And she disagreed with me, but would actually defend me in the class and would talk about how much opinions like mine were needed in the classroom. And
Wow.
this is in, the 2000s,
Yeah.
and she's in there like fighting for me. And I don't think you would see that anymore, and so that's not necessarily Big Eva. That's just the world,
Hmm.
right? Like even then, there was still like a sense of you could go to a state school like I went to, and I had a lot of problems for sure, but a Christian was welcome to you know talk about Christ and how that influenced their political leanings, and how in sociology you're talking about things like immigration, you're talking about the prison system, you're talking about all that stuff. And so she saw it as important for me to be able to share that stuff. Fast forward, I remember being I'm then a pastor, Obama's running, and that's about when you saw a big switch kind of happen. And even talking about my own mistakes, like I got caught up and swept up in all of that.
Mm.
That was like you met me. I had like a mohawk back then. I was a mess, man. And I was like, maybe there's a better world. And you just kind of saw this idea of kind of the liberal mindset infiltrating into the areas like the churches, and you had the emergent movement going on. Then you had all of that kind of stuff happening, and you're just kind of looking at it and you're going, what do we do here? Like, how does this happen? And in just kind of a funny roundabout way, I got lucky that with all that going on, that I was reintroduced to. I know everybody's like, don't talk about him, but Driscoll
Hmm.
helped kind of pull me out of that a little bit. But mainly Doug Wilson was huge in that. I happened to be living in a coffee shop that his dad had started, and just reading books in there and kind of looking around the world going, I don't know if this is good, and kind of started questioning stuff, and it brought me back. So like that's the early part. But then, when you plant a church, and we got going, 2010, 2011, interesting time, and just trying to figure out, and everything was this kind of faithful witness nuance. And I know you remember this, Chase. I remember when we moved to Boulder, everybody told us we had to get rid of the football teams we cheered for because we need to root for the Buffs and the Broncos. And you're an Aggie. Um, my college didn't really have a football team, but I'm from Cincinnati originally. I'm a Bengals fan. We were like, there's no way we're doing that,
Hmm.
right? And it was almost like you had to give up who you were. Like, I know that's a silly way to put it, but it
Yeah.
was like you need to enculturate yourself to everything there, and then help people kind of navigate it. Maybe start a Christian coffee shop where people could bump into Jesus and
Right.
this kind of stuff. And we tried all of that. That's what's wild, right? Like
Yeah.
we tried all of that. And in a way, it was kind of God's blessing, starting with like things like Ferguson, 2016. Everything got so crazy. What it did was it made us kind of reevaluate what's going on here and start questioning everything. But the funny thing was a lot of the evangelical leaders that we had looked up to all those years didn't seem to be asking any of the questions we were asking,
Correct. Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
And we were like, and I think a lot of people, especially people who listen to your podcast, can probably relate to this. That moment where you go, "Am I crazy?"
Right.
And I was thankful that our offices were right next to each other. So we got to talk about all this stuff all the time. And so it's like, well, at least if we're crazy, we got two crazy people.
Yeah. Totally.
We're not crazy and alone,
Yeah.
you know? And it's like, what does this mean? And you begin asking questions. And it's very disappointing when you see, when you go to these big Eva types, which over the years, our influence did grow in organizations like us.
Yeah.
We were
Particularly
never the
yours. Yeah. Particularly. Yeah.
Yeah, like, I mean, yeah, I was just around it a little bit longer than you, and I knew everybody in the organization. I was leading stuff in Acts 29 cohorts, things like that. And, the guy who is the Pope or whatever he is now of Acts 29, Brian Howard, was like my kind of personal mentor. And, and so you're kind of like looking at all of this and you're in on it all and you're going to these people and you're kind of just told to shut up. That's what I noticed. It was
Right.
like, you don't want to go there.
Right.
That's going to be a headache. And I'm like, yeah, but I thought we were supposed to be truthful.
Right.
And what we're saying isn't truthful. I remember sitting at a X29 conference and there was a panel and it was all about, like how white people basically needed to, shut up and do the reading
Yeah.
and how we were all bad. And I was like, and I was mixed up. It's funny. They actually used to call it back then Blacks 29 for all the black people, which is hilarious.
Yeah.
And I was friends with all those guys and I was in that group. I was the one who got to hang out with them. And I was like, I'm definitely not black. I'm like from the Midwest, and what am I doing here? And it was just a weird tension to kind of navigate with all the racial stuff going on. And you throw Trump into the mix, and all of a sudden you start asking questions. But what I noticed with Big Eva was they were like, if we press, then we might lose people. If we lose people, we lose influence. If we lose influence, we lose money
Mm.
and we lose prestige and all the things that I think maybe some of these guys are after more than they might even realize.
Yeah, I think that's dead on. And I think going back to the story of Boulder, like I've been told, if you want to do ministry in a context like that, you have to kind of adopt even the worldview and like the affections. So like there's very little challenging on like what the normal Boulderite would see as acceptable politically, culturally, in terms of sin. There's very little challenge to that kind of like predominant mood, you might say. And
Hmm.
there's an acquiescence to like actually challenge. So like our church during man, was it last year, 2 years ago? Like you called me on Friday or Saturday when Roe got overturned, and you're like, we got to preach on this on Sunday. And like other people didn't even want to touch it with a 10-foot pole because like that
Yeah,
that might
yeah,
offend somebody, which we think is insane. I mean,
yeah. Guys were calling me. Like, it was weird because we're not a big church. I mean, there really aren't, like, in the scope of, like, big church in Boulder, there aren't huge churches other than one out east of town. And we love those guys that they do some funky stuff, but, they're trying their best. But, it's not like big church. And so, like, it was interesting to me. People like, are you guys going to talk about it? Because they kind of knew who we were. And I was like, of course.
yeah,
And they were like, oh, don't do that.
yeah,
And I was shocked. Another good example of that was actually during COVID. Um, I remember coming to you, and it's funny how, and I think this ties into the conversation on the Big Eva side because how, like, what people ignore is how Big Eva impacts small Eva churches.
totally.
They're taking their cue from them
Yep.
on what's right and good and how we should operate.
Yeah.
And so I saw that most profoundly when I was meeting with pastors, not even in Boulder, just all over the country. Just, everybody was Zooming. I hate Zoom calls. And guys would just be like, well, what are you guys doing? And I'd be like, well, we're just trying to find a place to meet, and they're like, oh, we can't do that yet. And I was like, well, why is that? And they'd be like, oh, our people would get really mad.
Hmm.
And I'd just be like, well, what do you mean they'd get mad? And they're like, well, they they think we need to be masked and we need to, shelter in place and all that kind of stuff. And, and I remember telling one guy specifically, and I don't think our relationship has ever quite gotten back to normal, is I said, well, who's the pastor here, friend?
Yeah.
I thought you were to lead your church. It sounds like you're letting your people lead you and tell you what's best for the church. You're the shepherd. You need the guide. You need to lead. I mean, you're probably going to get some stuff wrong. I mean, you definitely are. It's part of leadership, right? There's no, like a lot of times leadership is the best, worst answer,
Right. Yeah.
and these guys were operating off of how do we keep people happy instead of how do we do what's biblically right and good for the nourishment of the body. And when I really thought about it, I was like, I think they're getting this cue from a lot of these big name leaders that are getting out there, and like Ed Stetzer talking to us all about how we need to be prepared to do more funerals than we've ever done before, and how there's going to be caskets everywhere. I don't remember exactly what he said. I'm probably exaggerating
No,
it
I mean,
some
I'm
of
pretty sure he said that stuff. Like it was insane. And you have
it.
Rick Warren out there doing the same thing. NT Wright with Francis Collins. It's just like, and you saw some churches doing that. So yeah, it was an accelerant to what we already kind of noticed in our little small neck of the woods. And Acts 29 is small beans compared to a lot of churches. There's so many churches in America. Acts 29 is only like 500 something or
Yeah.
300 something now. Yeah, but
Whoopsies.
oopsies. But we can like that it's a microcosm into the bigger thing. And
Yeah.
so being part of this, like you kind of shared some of what that's been like for you, but both of us, we went to seminary during that, and of course our seminary's gone very very left on racial matters and whether it's talking about Christian politics or whatever it is. But we went there and like they actually gave us decent tools. Unfortunately, we're probably not using them like they want us to, but like they taught us like good stuff in some ways. And so you're seeing all these institutions do that. And so what's it been like? I mean, you kind of mentioned like when you ask questions, you're kind of shut down. Is that I can think as a listener like that can't be real. Like he's got to be exaggerating. Like what was that actually like when we question or when you question kind of the normal whether Big Eva or regime evangelical, what is that experience like?
Yeah. I mean, it was really disheartening. I mean, because there was a lot of people that I thought were my friends. And with friends, especially as men, uh, we can fight and we should. Uh, you and I are best friends. We've had our knockdown, drag out fights. And that's fine. Like that's okay. I'll give you actually a real example. Acts 29 used to have this thing where like this group chat thing where everybody could get online and post stuff. And it was the middle of COVID. And I remember I just kind of like loosely, but kind of playfully as I do. Uh, a lot of times this is why I'm not as prolific on Twitter as you, because my humor does not translate over written word as much as it does in person. Some would say that in person it doesn't translate either, but but I said, if somebody tells me to put on a mask again, I think I'm going to jail.
Sure.
And I said like ha ha at the end to try to
Yeah.
soften it. And like dudes who, I mean, when they went through stuff in their church where like a child, like one of their children died of like a pastor, and I was there. Like I actually like flew to that state and was there and like met those guys and prayed with them and visited churches of a lot of these guys. I mean, these guys came after me like I was like the Antichrist. It was
Right.
shocking.
Yeah.
I mean, like I got called every name under the sun
Yeah.
on that chat, and I was like, and they're all just talking, yelling at me about loving my neighbor and stuff, and I was like, well, I'm not feeling super loved right now, like.
I too am your neighbor.
Yeah, I too, actually probably more than a lot of the people you're trying to defend from
Yeah.
a biblical standpoint, and so it was really disheartening to kind of just see people. Uh, it was almost as if their minds had been captive, and I've heard people call it like a mind virus and all of that sort of stuff. And just seeing all that came with that it was really disheartening. For a while, it was just it made me really sad. Like
Yeah.
I joke a lot, but I was like, these are men that I've known for a long time, and I've watched them try to grow a church and close down ministries and restart and go through marital problems and get out of it, and like all that real life stuff. Just like they were willing to throw it out the window for the sake of my opinion about something or even making a joke.
Yeah.
And it was quite shocking. And it led me to really kind of question even more.
Yeah.
Because when trust gets deteriorated like that, right? Like you start going, well, then what else am I missing?
Yeah.
And that was really big for me. Uh, but the win, I me, I like to put stuff in the positive. Is it also at the same time opened up a whole entire new door into, I think when people are in the Big Eva world, is they think that their groups, everybody knows them.
Mm-hmm.
There's a lot of groups out there. Like you remember this going to seminary where you'd bring up somebody like Mark Driscoll or Matt Chandler or even Piper, and people be like, who's that?
Right.
They come from a different tradition. And you're like,
Yeah.
they have no idea. And
Yeah.
then they would say names. I'm like, I've never heard of that guy. And they'd be like,
Right.
what? And so what it did was it opened up this whole entire new world of, there's a lot of people out there that I think are really smart that might have a better take on this.
Yep.
And it led me also, the last point I'll make is it led me to question, quite frankly, I know this sounds harsh, but the intelligence of a lot of these people. Um, I always like to downplay my own intelligence, and I always say I like to play the Bush game, like
Yeah.
act like a hillbilly from the backwoods, and then surprise them at the end, but like I know who I am, and I know where I'm at, and when I can look around and go, I might be one of the smartest people in the room, I think we're in trouble.
Sure.
Like, you know what I mean? And
Yeah.
and I started seeing that a lot, and I was just like, oh wow,
Yeah.
we've got a problem here. And so it just kind of led me to exploring more things and actually making a lot of new friendships and a lot of connections outside of that Big Eva world that I thought was the way forward as a pastor.
Yeah, and we could get into kind of like how we got bit by a lot of that questioning, but you can go listen
Yeah,
to our other episode
yeah,
on that from about a year and a half ago. But I think if somebody's listening, they're not in ministry, they're not part of kind of like they're not in the game, so to speak. Why do you think it's important? I mean, this book Shepherds for Sale, it's a New York
yeah.
Times bestseller now. Uh,
Hmm.
it's on Spotify Premium. Um, we're seeing a massive backlash. The smart ones are remaining silent. The ones who are
Hmm.
most in pain are speaking out and hollering because they got hit. But
Yeah.
why is it necessary for like the normal Christian, everyday Christian to understand how these things work?
Yeah, I think it's more important than they think. I remember sitting with a room full of elders from another church, and they told me that they just don't keep up with this stuff. And so they're worried about us, being our church, you and I predominantly, because we are keeping up with that stuff. And I'm like, well, your people read this stuff. They read they read the J.D. Greer's. They listen to his sermons.
Yeah.
That's what they're listening to in their car on the way to like work every day.
To listen to you
Um,
preach. they're they're listening to
yeah,
Matt Chandler on the way to listen to
yeah,
Matt Patrick
yeah,
preach.
yeah. They're not listening to me. I can guarantee that. Um, yeah, like I always get weary when somebody's like, "You're the best preacher I ever heard." I'm like, man, you need to learn how to use the internet better. But but um, I don't get that comment very often. But when I do, that's what I think. Um, but I think pastors need to know what their people are listening to. That's part of shepherding your people. But for just the people who attend the church, you can begin to trust these people so much because they're just in your ear all the time. And I know how convincing they are. I was a huge David French fan pre like 2017.
Yeah.
Like you didn't even know who he was, and I was like, "Oh, this guy's great. He's a
I had no idea.
columnist and all this stuff." And I was like, "Oh, he's great. He's this conservative." Now I'm just like, "Oh no, what did I do?" And
Yeah.
um, Russell Moore, just so your listeners know, I mean, you got a book signed by him.
Yeah. I said that on the air and I found the book after I got off the episode and I
Did
don't
he
know if
not sign it?
I don't think he signed that. I think he rejected. No, I'm just kidding. He didn't sign it. It's not signed. But I thought I did because I got a picture and I still can't. Maybe it's on your phone because you were there
Uh,
with me and you
oh,
took the
I'm
picture.
gonna look for that
You
tonight.
should
Yeah.
find the picture. But yeah, you're right. Yeah, I was very an admirer of him.
Yeah, and so I'm just saying that to say, like, there can be some shame wrapped up in that, right? Like, I don't want to get like psychological and get on all that stuff, but it's like it's like, oh man, but I really like this guy. He's a great communicator, and I think that's the danger is these guys know how to play the game. They know the rhetoric. They know how to hook you. They know how to bring you in, and they know how to hold you. And they're funny and they seem relatable. And all these guys, like I think Preston Sprinkle's like one of those guys who's
Totally.
great at that.
Yes. Yeah.
And evangelicals just love him. And they're like, then he's and I would just warn people, what I would say is when they give you an easy way out of dealing with cultural situations, that's when your red flags should go up because there's no easy way. And And by the way, when you read your Bible, when like the Apostle Paul, for example, is confronting idols of a culture or coming at something, it's not easy for him. Like it's never this like, hey, if you just kind of nuance it enough and you work your way in there, it like everybody's going to love you and it's going to go well. That's actually antithetical to what the Bible teaches. Like
Right.
there's going to be some bumps there. Now you shouldn't go out and try to be a jerk, but I think people need to be aware of what they're reading, and they need to read and they need to listen more broadly and get out there. And I think that's why like it's a grace of God in a sense in the age in which we live, where you have a podcast listenership, you do, or um, there's a lot of other like uh, Isker has his podcast, and all these guys, and it's not huge, but it's making a difference, and it can get out there. So there's lots of resources out there for people to help them understand it. So if your antennas go up and you go, that sounds weird, you know, um, maybe I shouldn't do this.
Right.
This doesn't sound like the Bible.
Yeah.
Like, I remember being at like a George Floyd thing because I got invited to it when it happened. And I was skeptical. I didn't participate in the sense where I got invited to be a prayer leader for it. And I was like, I'm just going to not do that because this seems weird. And and like, maybe I'm sharing too much. You can cut this if you want,
No,
Chase.
go for it. Yeah.
But I remember like all of a sudden people from different organizations that are not Christian organizations. This is supposed to be a prayer event for our city. And it was like basically, if you're white, you're evil. And we're going to make you kneel if you're white for basically admitting your sin. And I looked at my wife, I was like, we got to get out of here.
Right.
And so you got to recognize those moments
Yeah.
and be bold in those moments and get out because if you just keep going, man, it'll ruin your family. It'll ruin a lot of stuff, you know,
Totally. Yeah. And
it'll ruin your church.
we see that firsthand here in Boulder with lots of families that are struggling with either wives that are on Instagram too much and are kind of buying the narrative, or husbands that are cowards and won't have the conversation that needs to be had in the home and lead the home. We see it in churches, but it's all over the place. So I'm kind of jumping the gun here, but one of the
Yeah.
questions that comes up with a book like this is like, we'll have people ask us like, what do you think? And, like, about this book, because it's obviously, popular and best selling now. What would you recommend to somebody in the pew that maybe is at a church and now they have questions? Maybe the church has brought in, let's say, evangelical immigration table to speak to their church, or they've brought in somebody that is mentioned in Shepherds for Sale and they've endorsed that. What would you say to somebody in the pew? Because we're pastors, we know how it feels to be either attacked or, accused of stuff falsely or truly, or whatever it is. What would you recommend to somebody in the pew that reads this book and wants to do something about it? How should they go about that?
Yeah. I think every person's going to have to navigate that differently. You're going to have to I would, let me just put it this way. For most people, if you're just raising your family, you got your job and you're going to work and they bring in like the immigration table, I'd just say, get the hell out.
Right.
Like I used to not say that. I would be like, no, maybe they just need a little, but chances are if you're just there at that church and it's a mega church and you're maybe a member even, and you bring that up, I haven't seen much they're going to go, what? We
Right.
had no idea. Right? Like if you're at JD Greer's church
Right.
and you bring up Megan Basham's book, Shepherds for Sale, based off of his response of what comes back, they are not going to listen to you.
No.
They have gone ahead and tried to just get out of it. Now, I think for those that are probably in a more normal church, our church made a lot of mistakes in a lot of areas here, and we grew over time. And I think when I say a normal church, I just like a normal sized church that's trying to be faithful, love God, preach the gospel, raise children well, all that kind of stuff, right? Administer the ordinances rightly, all that kind of stuff. You have an opportunity there to
Hmm.
bring stuff up, and go, hey, have you read this? Check it out, and just see what the responses are,
Yeah.
you know, and just go like and be patient, and especially if the pastor's young, it's easy to get swept away, as maybe that person once was too,
Yeah.
you know. the warning I would give that person is don't be black-pilled.
Yeah.
Don't take the black pill. Don't go off the deep end and hate everything and just leave the church and the church is corrupt and become a papist or or go to the Orthodox church because
Right.
it's out. Like there's plenty of great churches out there, right?
Right. Yeah.
That you can find, but I would say be patient with them, and if they show an inclination to learn, if they're willing to, as they say, do the reading,
Yeah. Right.
then you have something to go with. You've won a brother. I think there's some biblical precedent for that.
Yeah.
And if you do leave a church, I think you should let them know why in a kind Christian way. But just it's something that I for me, like if as a pastor, but like if I was just a person in church, I couldn't raise my family in that.
No.
I mean, like, yeah, like I told you earlier today, I was just curious. I was like, maybe JD, like I'm a guy who wants to think the best of people. I'm like, maybe JD's learned, maybe he's doing something. I wonder if he has a podcast. And of course he does. And so I listened to it. I listened to an episode on homeschool versus public school versus Christian school. And like 30 seconds in, I was like, he hasn't learned anything. He made fun of all the homeschool crowd about how they have no social skills and
Oh,
how
wow.
there's really no proof that, um, private Christian school or homeschool has a spiritual benefit,
Wow.
for those people. Then later he said they did. I'm like, that's the same thing he freaking just did in his article, and Megan Basham called him out. I'm like, these guys just speak out of two sides of their mouth. I'm like, you can't win there,
Yeah.
like, so, they're dust off your sandals, move on.
Yeah. Totally. Well, I want to get to kind of like what do you think drives these guys, and I want to some podcasts and go for it if they want to psychoanalyze, but I just want to speak as we're two pastors and we kind of know what it's like to be in ministry. But before I do that, I do want to like touch on like look like it can be very intimidating and scary. I mean, just to be frank, when
Yeah.
people online find your stuff and start posting it everywhere, not that that's happened to us, but it can be
Oh, it
like
has.
it can be intimidating. So you have to imagine who they are, and they're all of a sudden this bestseller comes out and it names the name, your name, Matt Patrick said these things in this
Yeah.
year. Like we've seen their response, which is very like, no, I'm pure, I'm fine. Like Gavin Ortland's was classic. Like he advocated for climate change policies. He wants more
Yeah.
Christians to believe in that, and he should just own it and say, yeah, this is what I believe. And that's all she said in the book was like, he's been advocating for this, and like he freaks out about it. But we've all made mistakes in ministry. I mean, that's one thing that a lot of people in the pews don't understand many
Hmm.
times, and I didn't understand this growing up. Being a member of a church, like the pastor's a human too. Their pastors are people too, and
Yeah.
and so like when you think about mistakes you've made in ministry, if you were like, if Basham found one of your sermons from back in the day that said something really suspicious, or
Yeah.
show that you were selling out to a leftist or whatever it was, how would you hope you would have the character to respond? What would you think about that? Before we hear from Matt on that question, I wanted to make sure you knew about something that I really enjoy from Hillsdale College. Time today is one of our most precious commodities. All of us feel strapped for time, and we always want to be learning. If you're listening to this podcast, you're probably like me, you enjoy learning, and it can be really hard out there to find where are good resources, who can you trust, what can you learn about. You want to learn about history, economics, great works of literature, the meaning of the U.S. Constitution. These are really important topics that most of us didn't study in school, and so you can either get a refresher, you can get some great content, because Hillsdale College is offering more than 40 free online classes. That's 40 free online courses in the most important and enduring subjects today. You can learn about everything from the works of C.S. Lewis, the books of Genesis, the meaning of the U.S. Constitution, American citizenship and its decline, through Hillsdale College's online courses, all available for free. I'd personally recommend The Rise and Fall of the Roman Republic. Great course if you're a guy. The Roman Republic and the decline of the Roman Empire is always on your mind anyways. So head over to this free 12-lecture course. Students will explore fascinating history of the Roman Republic, including how the ancient Romans rose from a small village in Italy and then came to dominate the Mediterranean world, the virtues necessary to preserve a republic, and an examination of why Rome collapsed into tyranny and the challenges common to free governments everywhere, just like ours. This course is self-paced, so you can start whenever, wherever you want. Just head over to hillsdale.edu/proof to enroll. There's no cost, and it's easy to get started. Head over to hillsdale.edu/proof to register. That's hillsdale.edu/proof.
Yeah, I mean, people can find stuff on our website that I said that's wrong, and we haven't taken it down.
Maybe we should.
So maybe we should. And now I'm thinking about that. Maybe we need to cut this out.
We just have a lot going on with this building, and like we can't like trying to edit a
Yeah.
website. It's like
BoulderWellbacks.org/give if anybody wants to help out there
yeah.
to ease Chase and I's pain. Sorry.
You're great.
Yeah, man. You know, I don't want to sound boastful, but I hope I'd be a man. You know, and just there's a level of being able to receive just criticism. Like if you said something and you said it, and here I'll pick on myself. I'll give the example of the thing that I said. I remember it was during COVID. It was during BLM. We're streaming a service, and all the racism stuff's going on, and I'm like, yeah, racism's bad. Like that's not a good thing. And I was just like, yeah, like very plain. I was new. I didn't know all the terminology, and I kept hearing this term anti-racist thrown out, right? And I was like, and I said in a sermon, like I said this, it's not enough to be just against racism. We need to be anti-racist. That's what people say now. Like we're anti-racism. And I was like, of course we are. And then I got done and everybody's like, Matt, do you know what you just said? I was like, no. And they're like, yeah, that's a whole talking point of BLM and here's what that means. And I was like, oh no, you know, and like, I mean, I would own it. I'd be like, yeah, I said that. I didn't know what I was saying, you know, and I
Yeah.
made a mistake. Or even like, we've hosted speakers in our church that I would never host again.
Right.
And I would just own that and go, yeah, man, like that was unwise.
Yeah.
That was immature. I need to repent of that and how I led our people. And I'm not going to do that again. You know, like it's really, that's the funny thing about it, Chase, is this isn't hard.
Right.
Like you don't have to, I don't, I mean, I'm sure there's online people that are annoying that if like J.D. Greer or whoever, if I think Russell Moore is his own category, so I won't even deal with that. But
yeah,
since we're talking about the big thing is like Gavin Ortland and J.D. Greer are replying, if they just came out and were like, you know, Megan's got some points. I don't know if I agree 100% on everything, but I can see where she's coming from on that and how people could take it that way. And that was pretty unwise of me. And I'm really sorry that I did that. Instead, what these guys are doing is they're giving these things where people are going, well, they did apologize. I'm like, no, they didn't. What they said was, I'm sorry for how you received that.
exactly. Yeah.
And that's not an apology.
Right.
Right. And so people need to recognize that. But I think what pastors need to be able to do is be humble enough to admit when they were wrong.
Yeah.
And grow from it. Like, quite frankly, Megan gave them, she was like, I'm not done with the book. She's way kinder. They're really lucky that a woman wrote that book.
Yeah, no kidding. Yeah, you and I would have written a very scathing book talking about illustrations from minor prophets and
Yeah, I'm
millstones
like,
around necks.
yeah, you got imprecatory psalms getting thrown down and like, and all of this stuff. But like, I mean, I really think she actually, from what I've read so far, I haven't completed it. So, in fairness, but it seems like I'm like, yeah, that makes sense. And you said that, and these things are there, and maybe she misunderstood you slightly, but like, you know, you have to understand how people take it, right? Like how they receive what you say. And as a pastor, you're responsible for that.
Yeah.
Right? Like you know what you're doing. And you have to go back, and that's the hard thing. These guys are looking at it now. But if you were saying things like, we need to be about justice and really understand the oppressed and all of these kinds of things in 2020, that had a different meaning
Totally.
than it does saying that right now.
Yeah, absolutely.
And so they're actually not even contextualizing what they said appropriately. I'm like, you got swept up, man.
Yeah.
You got swept up.
Yeah.
Just say I'm sorry.
Yeah, that's all you got to do. Isn't that a wild Christian response? And that's what we talked before we got on there is like a lot of these guys, like they will dunk on nominal Christianity and all they want, but that's all they are. is like
Yeah,
they seem to just be like towing the line of what's popular culturally, whether it's regards to sexuality or race, you name the topic culturally, and they're just kind of like, yeah, yeah, they're not really coming out with what they're saying. They're
yeah,
kind of being nominally Christian about how they approach the Bible.
yeah, yeah. That's it. They've been taken captive. Like that's the thing is they're like we don't want nominal Christianity. Like Matt Chandler is like famous for that. Like I just want like the fake Christianity of the South to die.
Yeah,
And I'm like living in Boulder. I'm like, bro,
you don't want that.
you don't want that.
Right,
Like I promise. Like you don't.
right.
Like I want everybody to assume that like it's good for me to put my kids in Awanas.
Yeah,
Like
right.
that would be great.
That would be
Like I don't
amazing.
understand. Like and like I would say the question I think maybe listeners can ask people that is really profound. I'm stealing this from our friend Brian Brown. Is do you want the world to be more Christian?
Right,
And if you're like, well, what do you mean by that? Well, first off, then you're a midwit.
right.
Just stop. Because the answer is like the world should be more Christian.
Yeah,
Like that's what we want. That's the Great Commission. That's what we're after. But these guys are like they hate nominalism so much, but really what they're propagating is more nominalism through what they're speaking. And I would also add on to that, I don't know if a lot of these guys when I listen to them have actually quite really understood how much things like CRT has infected their brain.
right.
Because when you listen to it, it's all oppressed oppressor.
Yep.
And if you're in a position of power, then you must be the oppressor. But the funny thing is, they're in the positions of power.
I know.
And
Wild.
you're just like, that's another moment where you go, am I crazy?
Right.
You're the one with the Crossway book deal, bro.
Yeah. And you're telling me don't write a book. Never write a book until you're 52. And you're
Yeah.
like,
And
you're writing books right now.
yeah, it's like, yeah, you got to be radical. Also, I've also got a multi-million-dollar house, which, by the way, I think's awesome.
Good for you.
I'm like, great, good for you. I mean, like, according to the newspapers here in Boulder, you and I are millionaires funded by Texas oil money. So
Yeah. Yeah.
I'm still waiting for that check.
Still waiting for that.
If any Texas oil men want to like fund us, we're all ears.
Welcome.
But like it's just funny to me that it's like they're operating on that oppressed oppressor mindset, and they can't seem to see it themselves.
Yep.
And
It's
so
wild.
it makes me worried for them, to be quite frankly. It saddens me. I know we joke a lot about it, and
Yeah.
it's very easy to meme about them.
Totally.
Um,
Very
and
memeable.
yeah, and maybe just to wrap it up too on that point was like these guys don't seem to be able to laugh about it at all.
No.
Like there's a humor in being wrong that you can embrace, where
Yeah.
you're like, yeah, or have your friends make fun of you. You said something dumb and they make fun of you and tease you about it.
Yeah.
That like if your friend calls you gay, it's like,
Right.
well, maybe what I said was gay. I don't know, like, but
Yeah.
if you're like always like, I got to defend and write, like JD Greer, that article he wrote he wrote that so long intentionally, that, right? Like he wrote that so people didn't make it through it.
Mm-hmm.
Like instead he could have just been like, yeah, what I said was dumb. My bad.
Yeah. It's crazy. And one of the things, we're pastors, that's our vocation. And so we're very curious about the way people are formed in their souls and how they're being formed into Christ. And invariably that gets into motives and desires and
Hmm.
how they're raised and all that kind of stuff. And so, from your experience with pastors, you probably have more experience than I do with just networking and all this kind of stuff. And you're really good at it. What do you think drives a lot of these guys, like not just pastors, but particularly like the big figures in Big Eva, whether it's whether we want to talk about Gavin Orland or his dad Ray Orland or JD Greer or I think Russell Moore's on another level and David French might be
Hmm.
too, but
Yeah.
just kind of big figures in evangelical. What's driving them? Like why are they so unwilling to own what they've done?
That's a good question. Uh, I'm not a guy who jumps to the negative on all those guys,
Right.
and I don't want to group them all together because they've probably done and said some really good things and helped some people,
Yeah.
and that's not to be ignored. But uh, I think it's funny because they'll talk about like the echo chambers,
Yeah.
that we all have. They're an echo chamber too. Like, and sometimes that's okay. But I think what they're fearful of is when you build a church, and this is a little insider baseball talk, right? You know, when you build a church and you have an organization and you have something that has hundreds of employees like these churches do, you know, when you look at it and you go, if I'm going to take a stand on something, I don't know what's going to happen.
Right.
And people are going to lose jobs, maybe, or this isn't going to be what it was, and how are we going to pay off this bill? So I think there's a lot of pressures that are pragmatic that come into play there that naturally set themselves up in that area. I remember meeting with the megachurch one time. They wanted to talk to us because they're like, "We think your model for discipleship is good. Can you come to our church and tell us how to do that?" And I was like, "Sure." And I met with them, and it was like 30 minutes in, and they're like, "We can just stop. We're not going to do any of this
Oh,
because
wow.
it would be detrimental. Like our people just wouldn't do that."
Huh.
And I was like, "Oh, okay. Well, good luck."
Yeah, right.
You know what I mean? I was just like, huh. And it was like, because I talked about church discipline,
Hmm.
and they're like, "Well, we're too big to do church discipline." And I'm like, "Well, then you're not a church."
Right.
you know and like I said it just like that, and the room got really awkward,
Yeah,
and
sure.
they're like, "Well, thanks for coming out, and hope you enjoyed your sandwich."
Fantastic.
But I think a lot of these guys, I think pragmatism has them. I won't say what I was going to say. Has them caught up,
Yeah, sure.
and so there's that. And then, you know, what if they lose their platform? What if these people, like J.D. Greer talks a lot about how 70% of his community is Democrat,
Yeah.
and so if I'm going to reach them with the gospel, I have to talk to them this way. Like, that's not true.
Right.
And so I think they've bought a lie that they need to repent of and turn from. And, just because you have a crowd doesn't mean that you're doing a good thing. Even though maybe good things can come out of that. God can use that for sure. But I think a lot of these guys' motivation is being successful. Like the big thing in Acts 29, and I had to speak to that, not to knock it, but because that's where we came from, was it's an organization full of people who would claim that they all had bad dads.
Sure.
That was like always the joke. And if anybody says that's not true, I'm like, no, that's true. And so it's an organization full of people who wanted to prove themselves that they were good enough and that they could make it and that they wouldn't be like their dad.
Yeah.
And they forgot to respect their father in the process of doing that. And so they're on this weird mission to prove themselves. And a lot of these guys, I don't know Gavin. I mean, like I know about Gavin's dad. I don't think he falls in that category. I know nothing about JD Cruz. But I think just Big Eva in general has this ethos of you know, I must show how competent I am at all times.
Hmm.
And instead, and you know this language, we use this in our church a lot, but we're more interested in communion. Like, who are we doing this stuff with?
Right.
And what does that look like? Where these guys, if they weren't pastors, I'm afraid a lot of them would be the guys who are 50 years old and divorced and driving down, Rodeo Drive in a yellow Corvette with a 20-year-old girlfriend with fake boobs and just like yelling out the window and thinking they looked awesome.
Sure.
Like,
Yeah.
they're like, "Aren't I awesome?" And you're like, "No, not really." Like,
Right.
like, like we get it. You're a good speaker. Cool.
Yeah.
And so I think a lot of these guys are trying to show their own competence, and that gets in the way. Maybe that was a really unfair analogy to use.
But I think you're onto something. Like guys want to be successful. They want to achieve. And once you feel like you've achieved something, I mean, look, you got to respect the excellence. You got to respect the game. If you are able to build a multi-site church in America, that's rare. And so if
Yeah,
you get in ministry and you're constantly told these are the best ministers because they're successful, and then let's say you have, daddy issues, and then you get out there and you have achieved something, and you've got 200,000 YouTube subscribers, you work under your dad, or you plant a multi-site church in North Carolina or Texas, or you could look at Rick Warren, and so the idea of losing that success for speaking clearly and plainly about biblical matters, I think that traps a lot of guys. That's like
Yeah.
a irreconcilable difference they have with their own story and their own ministry and what the Bible teaches. Would you say that's fair?
Yeah, it's 100% fair. And the truth is that like if you go after preaching the Bible plainly and directly, like you're if you've got a big church, you're going to lose people. I mean, like we were our church, and I'm not saying this to brag. I'm almost saying it to our same. Like we were starting to clip that 400 number in a place like Boulder, which was unheard of. And then you and I were like, well, I think we were wrong.
Right.
And now we're like a small church.
Yeah, right.
And I've heard from other guys like, oh, Matt and Chase are just ruining what they have.
Yeah.
And I'm like, I haven't felt more free in ministry right now than I've ever felt before.
Yeah.
I'm having more fun than I've ever had before. There's more alignment. Um, by God's grace, we're growing again. We're moving into a building. We've seen good things happen. But there was some serious relational loss that came with making that move.
Yep.
And I don't think a lot of guys are willing to do that. And when
Right.
you're really big, man, that, like actually my heart goes out. Like I would love to see a guy do it. And that's why like I know people like to rip on MacArthur, but like that's why like I really actually respect MacArthur. You know, he's kind of just stayed the same,
Yeah, totally.
you know, and he said stuff like I remember back when he told Beth Moore to go home. You and I both were like, "Ooh, that
Yeah.
felt that felt bad." Like, you know, like I don't know what to do with that, you know. Or like when he stayed open during COVID, he just kind of like so like I think there's a way to he's got a big church, big influence to do it right. But like I don't think that's the norm either. I think most guys are gonna have if God blesses you with a few hundred people and you get to lead that way and you get to bless those people and you know baptize some children, not babies because we're Baptists, but
Right.
you
Of
know,
course.
and you get to see people saved and you get to like catechize children and all that kind of good stuff. Like, man, that's a good place to be. And I'm just afraid that these guys are just too caught up in the world in which they've been trained.
Yeah, for sure. So with kind of the conversation so far and with the book, I've talked with several people and I think you have too, where it's like, who can we trust? And that question resonates with me because I felt the same way. Where it's like, I remember um looking up all these people I respected. And that's part of the reason I got on Twitter was to see what they were actually saying, because that's where people
Hmm.
say what they actually believe. And
Hmm.
all these authors, like go down the list, and I was like, they're all saying the same thing, and I disagree with what they're saying on this matter. And that really colors my view of how they've interpreted everything. But one guy on this particular matter, John Frame, I remember sitting on my sofa and I was like, please don't let Frame go woke. Like, please. And so I messaged him and I was like, "Are you woke?" Just very like autistically,
Yeah,
like
that's how you are.
that's how I am. He's like, "No, it's bad," and I was like, I like cried because I was like,
Yeah,
That's how alone I felt in the midst of all this, which is like I knew you and I were aligned, and like my household
yeah,
was pretty in sync, but like I was just like, man, like everything was crumbling that I had trusted in. So that I feel like other people might feel that way too.
yeah.
Who can I trust? Who can I look to? And what would you say to somebody like that that's maybe at another church?
Hmm.
What are we to do with this information? What's the answer?
Yeah, I think it's a good question. I think Megan's book, by being where it is, I mean, you said it's number 5 on the New York Times bestseller list. I mean, that's wild, you know. So that means like a lot of people are reading it. I told you earlier, I went to lunch the other day with a guy, you know, and he goes to a mega church, and he's a friend of mine. I coach baseball with him and stuff, and he's like, "Hey, I'm reading this book, and what do you know about my church?" I'm like, "Well, what book are you reading?" He's like, "It's called Shepherds for Sale." And this guy like is the most like basic dude, you know, in carpentry and stuff.
Yeah,
And I'm like, "Wait, for real?" And he's like, "Yeah." I was like, "I mean, I'm not friends with Megan, but like I know Chase." Like, and he's like, "Oh, you guys know her? Like, that's great." I was like, "I don't." Like, I'm trying to be very clear, but
yeah,
like, so like average students, and he's asking that question: "Is my church okay?"
yeah,
And I think if you can, I think that's a good question to ask. I think everybody should ask that in any church that they go to. Um, and the question is, who can you trust? And it's really hard, man. You and I joke about how like all of our heroes are dead,
Hmm.
you know, uh, and it's really hard to where like what we I think people make a mistake. We're looking for that one voice to rise up. We're like, who's the voice of our generation to come?
Sure.
And I just think it looks different now. It's not going to be that. My hope for people is that it's a very normal local church pastor that will converse with them about this, will reject things that are not of scripture, that like are in there. I think you can read these things and you can go through and you can find a community, you can listen to your podcast and listen to the people that you have on and find these kinds of things and just really like kind of look at it and go, who can I trust? There are people out there. I would say people have standed the test of time
Yeah.
and haven't just gone sideways.
Yeah.
You know, some people, I mean, I know it's popular to dump on Doug Wilson, but he's been right about a lot of stuff.
Totally.
I think he's generally trustworthy, right? Like there's people like that that you can get out there. I think finding um, the good reading materials and things like that, it's becoming easier to navigate, but it is really hard. But I think there's a lot. That's the thing. I think there's so many really just good pastors out there, just laboring away, and they're just not letting this junk into their church. And getting back to like, I trust my pastor and my elders because they've proven over time that they're trustworthy men,
Yeah.
and I know them. I can go to them with questions.
Yeah. Yeah. And that's really important. And I think, if you look at kind of that test of time as well, just simple, like, look at who is calling out the people who are wrong today, obviously wrong, like Russell Moore. Who was saying that 10 years ago? Because like I
Yeah,
remember when Doug Wilson like wrote against I think not only Moore but Keller. I'd have to find the article. And I was like, what's wrong with this guy? Like, why is he attacking other Christians? And why is he doing this?
yeah,
And now I look back, I'm like, he saw things that I did not see, that I could not see at the time. And I
hmm
think when you find people like that, it's not that you give them kind of like a carte blanche of trust, but
no,
trust is a really complex thing, relationally and in the church. And so there are a lot of voices out there who have something to offer. And like you said, go talk to your local church pastor and find a church that isn't like bought into the pragmatic game of growth numerically over growth and discipleship.
yeah,
That's a really key thing for us at the Well, is like we want to actually form disciples into Christ and not just like grow numerically. Because like I know you, if we unchristian Matt and we just ran a play, like you could attract crowds. Like that
yeah,
would be you I remember one time we were at lunch, you were like, oh, I know how to do that. Like, watch this. I'll post on Facebook and lots of people like it. And lots of people liked it. And I was like, I don't know how you do that. Like, that's
yeah. I
crazy.
posted a piece of garbage on Facebook. I think I said, parents, your children don't need your presence; they need your presence. And it was like my most liked post. I'm like, that's all it takes.
I know.
It's not hard,
It's
you know.
crazy.
And it's so stupid. I hate it so much. On a more serious, like I think what I would say too to that is become a studier of church history. Like study church history, and I think that's one of the things that actually you led me well in during COVID was, well, the church surely has gone through something like this before.
Yeah.
We should see what they did.
Right.
And so you can trust people who've been there and done it too,
Yeah.
and navigated it well. And so it's like there's very few things that we're like, oh, this is nobody else has ever experienced this before.
Right.
And church history can be a great friend to a Christian. And I think it gets kind of put into the corner of like, oh, that's nerdy or that's boring.
Right.
No, it's really not.
It's
You know,
extremely practical
it's
because you
very
can
practical.
you can learn so much from what they did and why they did it and what motivated them, their context, and then you can go like, what are the principles they were applying? How are they interpreting the Bible? And it can induce sadness because you're like, oh my gosh, look what we do today compared to what they used to do. But it can really provide more context. And so yeah, I hope that was helpful for the listeners. Anything else you want to add on that kind of last point?
No, I mean, I think just good local churches, man. That's what we need. That's what we're after, and And man, if you've got a good church and it's imperfect, just like be a friend to that pastor appropriately. He may not want to be your friend, and that's his prerogative, by the way. But but like just be a like as our the crazies like to say, a faithful witness to them.
Yeah, sure.
But like just like being there is good, and just being around those other men that are trying to struggle and figure stuff out. I just love the relationships I have in my church right now. It's so much fun, and look to people who are able to laugh at themselves and have a good time. And remember, the left can't meme, and so if they don't ever meme, that's probably not where you want to be.
Yeah, totally. Absolutely. Well, Matt, it was great talking with you. I've always enjoyed
Yeah,
talking with you and hearing your thoughts. Is there any place you want to point people to, website or Twitter handle or anything like that?
yeah. No, I'm not all over the place. I like kind of playing behind the scenes, but I am on Twitter every once in a while. So it's MattPat1. So you can find me there. And so, yeah, I randomly will get myself in trouble or post something on there. But mainly, I just like to make fun of Chase on Twitter. So
It's true. It's true.
yeah,
Well, appreciate you, brother. Thanks for
yeah,
coming on
you
the show
too, man.
tonight.
Yeah, thanks for having me, man.
Thanks for tuning in again to another episode of Foolproof Theology. I hope you enjoyed this episode. You can find it anywhere where podcasts are found, also on YouTube. Head over there and subscribe today. Give it a like, leave a comment, and you can share this episode with anyone. I also want to make sure you know about the Patreon. If you sign up on the Patreon, you get early access to every episode. You can ask me questions, give me show prompts there. We can have great conversations on the Patreon. That link will be in the show notes. Sign up at $5 or $15 a month and get some swag as you subscribe. Thanks for joining today. We'll see you next time.